So now, actually, I think it's time for Ted and David to introduce themselves. And each one of those authors of this paper have had a very long and substantial history with the 9/11 Truth Movement. I'm sure all of you know them, but I'm going to let them go through their history with the 9/11 Truth Movement, a little bit about them, and then we will start with a presentation. So who wants to start, Ted or David?
Go for it,
Yeah.
Ted.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. Thanks for showing up today. And thank you to the people who are watching this in the future. You all who are here pretty much know me, but my name is Ted Walter. I've been active in the 9/11 Truth Movement since about 2006 and really got going in 2008, 2009 when I joined the New York City 9/11 Ballot Initiative. And over the course of 2008, 2009, I probably gathered a few thousand signatures on the streets of New York City to get a new 9/11 investigation, a new 9/11 commission in New York City. That initiative didn't pan out, unfortunately. And from there, I continued working with the group that we set up, to sponsor that initiative, New York City Coalition for Accountability Now, NYC Can. And in 2010, I moved to the Bay Area to go to grad school at UC Berkeley, studied public policy. And after a little while, took a little bit of a break. But then once I finished grad school, I started getting active again in the movement and got very involved with Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth because I was out there in the Bay Area. And of course, that's where their headquarters is. And 2014, moved back to New York, to New York City. And eventually by 2015, started working full time with Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And I was there for 8 years, worked very closely with Richard, who was here, and did a lot of things over those years, wrote a lot of articles, wrote some publications like Beyond Misinformation, What Science Says About the Destruction of World Trade Center Buildings 1, 2, and 7. Probably most recently in my work with AE, I drafted a request for correction to NIST. There was about 100 pages that detailed some of the most serious errors and what we probably call fraudulent aspects of the NIST report. And the goal was to try to get NIST to correct their report, which was always, there was always that was always going to be a long shot. But the goal of that was to, create a paper trail of NIST being unable to defend the deficiencies in their report. And I think that's what we managed to do. I left AE 9/11 Truth in January of this year, and over the past several months, I've worked to set up the new version of the International Center for 9/11 Justice. And so that's why we're here today. The center has partnered with the Journal of 9/11 Studies, formerly partnered with the Journal, as well as the 9/11 Consensus Panel. And most recently, the Journal of 9/11 Studies has published a new paper on World Trade Center Building 7, which I co-authored with David Chandler, as well as Tony Szamboti. So that's in a nutshell my history with the movement. I'm really honored to be in this role and really overjoyed to have started this organization, this new version of what was previously the International Center for 9/11 Studies. And I really look forward to what this organization, along with all of our partners in the 9/11 Truth Movement, can accomplish in the coming months and years. I think we've all sort of felt that in a certain way, maybe the dam is just starting to break on this issue. Maybe it took until after 20 years for the dam to really start to break. We had to get past that hump. And maybe that's where we are now. And we're in the sweet spot where people are starting to be more open-minded. There's a younger generation. But at the same time, we're not so far away from the event that if we manage to achieve our ultimate goal, that it wouldn't have a huge impact on our society. And I think that's what we're all striving for. And so I'm honored to be a part of that endeavor with all of you. So, David?
Thanks, Ted.
Okay.
Thanks, Ted. David?
Okay. When people ask me how I got started in the 9/11 Truth Movement, my answer these days is that it started in the 1980s when I was involved with working with refugees through a church in Southern California. It's called the Sanctuary Movement. We were sheltering people who were fleeing death squads that were being supported by the CIA. And we heard all of the firsthand accounts from these people of, what they went through, and they were being denied asylum routinely when they would come here and so forth. So what it did for me was it got me past this whole hang up of American exceptionalism, where, would the American government ever do anything so evil as 9/11? That wasn't an issue for me. I knew that we had it in our capacity to be as evil as anybody else. And it's just a matter of, in this case, in the case of 9/11, it was, it was within the borders. And I mean, the first words out of my mouth when I went to school that morning, I was teaching at high school, and I met a like-minded faculty member, and I said, well, looks like the chickens have come home to roost. And that was my attitude early on until I started. It was about the same time Ted was saying, around 2006, somewhere in there, 2006 or 7, I started doing some work. I was I was inspired to jump in because I have a physics background, but I heard something from Stephen Jones, a very brief thing, and I thought, whoa, here's a physicist looking at what he can see. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Maybe there's a role for me there. And then I saw the stuff that Jim Hoffman had up on his website, and that was just opening the floodgates of all this information that was available. So I started digging in, and then I had an opportunity to give a talk at a physics conference, a physics teachers conference, actually, at Occidental College, American Association of Physics Teachers. It's a group of teachers. And since I was going to be doing that, and I had a few months lead time, I thought these guys need a little bit more substance than just things I've learned on the internet. So I started doing some measurements because I have a tool. Everybody knows it's like if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? Well, I could measure motion on video. And so video frames. And there's a lot of things to measure. I saw these little things getting spurting out of the side of the building. Oh yeah, 150 miles an hour. Whoa. There's things being thrown horizontally. Big chunks of stuff, multi-ton objects, or whatever they were, but they were coming out of there at around 60 miles an hour, horizontally out of a building. How do you do that? And anyway, that kind of thing is what got me moving. And then Justin Keogh saw the things I posted on YouTube and invited me to work on the team with AE, Architects and Engineers. And so he and I and anyway, a number of people were on this little video committee. And I wasn't into just generally working with videos. I wanted to do these little research videos. And so the first video I did for AE was the one where it shows the corner of the building, and it says it's like the North Tower exploding. That video, within a couple months, had 100,000 hits. I mean, it was like, this is a way to actually be heard. And it was like, whoa. So I really focused a lot of my attention on this. The thing I'm interested in about this paper that we just did is I've never actually written up my research on Building 7 as a paper. And the thing is, there's so many really deep nuances in terms both of the issue and NIST's fraudulent response. I mean, their fraud is far deeper than most people realize. And I wanted to try to explain that, and you can't just see that in a YouTube clip. So I was really pleased when Ted brought up the idea of doing this sort of a summary thing. Earlier, I was doing some measurements. Ted and I got working together over this request for correction that AE was doing. And the thing that was good about this collaboration was he kept pushing me. He said, well, why don't you measure this? Why don't you measure this? And so I kept pulling out my hammer and hitting more nails, So it was a really satisfying opportunity. And in the process, we found some new things. I guess I'll tell them later on. But so as far as who I am, I'm a high school teacher. I've also taught junior college level physics, and you don't need to be into quantum mechanics or any of that kind of good stuff to understand buildings falling down. So the kind of physics that I deal with on a routine basis in my classes is exactly the kind of physics that applies to this investigation. So anyway, that's a little bit of who I am and what I've been about in the movement. So.
Okay, thanks, David. We have more people coming in. I'm welcoming everybody. You'll be on mute for the rest of the session, but I just love to see some of these people coming in, people I know for some time, good friends. So before we start the discussion between with Ted and David, I have to tell you something. About 2 days ago, I read the whole paper that they're going to be discussing, and I was amazed. I was excited. I do not have a history of math or physics, but I was able to understand everything in that paper. It's written for the layperson. It's an amazing paper. So if you get a chance to read it, that's fantastic. In the meantime, Ted and David are going to give you the takeaway points from it. So I'm just so impressed with that paper. So anyway, that's great. And welcome everybody again. And who is going to start, Ted or David?
Well, Ted, I believe.
Okay, Ted, would you take it away?
Thanks, Fran. And before I really get into it, I just want to say a couple quick words about the this takeaways series. And especially for anybody who might be watching this in the future who thinks, oh my God, this is going to take forever and it's going to be super complicated. You know, stay right here, because the whole point of this is to really boil down the discoveries and the findings that are in this paper and make them easy for folks to understand. They really aren't, in many ways, aren't that complicated. There's a lot of nuances, a lot of small details, but in big picture, this is pretty straightforward. And I think it's important information, important knowledge that everybody can retain, everybody who cares about this issue. And I think it's important that everybody does, so that, because we made some findings here that are pretty definitive, that tell us about the collapse of this building that we didn't quite fully know before, and now we know. So with that, I will let me just bring up an image of the paper here. Perhaps most of you have seen it by now, but many won't have, and I'm sure many of you haven't read it, and hopefully you will go and read it, you know, in the coming days or weeks. Bear with me here. All right, so there's just a picture of the front page of the paper. It's called The Instantaneous Freefall of World Trade Center Building 7 and NIST's Attempt to Hide It. So the key word in the title of this paper, in a way, is the word instantaneous, because we've known for many years that Building 7 came down in free fall. NIST admitted to it finally in its final report that was issued late 2008, after initially denying that it came down in free fall. Due to David's public comment, and perhaps Stephen Jones's as well, NIST went in and changed their finding, or their description of the building's downward motion, admitted that it came down in free fall. But over the years, what this paper really is a culmination of, you know, this journey that began back in 2008 when with that whole situation, NIST claiming that it did not come down in free fall and then being forced to admit that it did. Right after the final report came out, David started, and others realized that they had effectively admitted in their report that it came down in free fall, but they had this three-stage collapse, three stages of downward motion, starting with this stage one, where the building allegedly descended a little bit and sort of slowly and sort of built up to free fall. And David started looking at it and said, in these videos that he published back in 2008, early 2009, I don't see that there's any movement before the free fall begins. It looks like it's just sitting there to me. And he wasn't able to detect really any movement at all. And it's like NIST had started the clock early. So that was the beginning of this journey. And I mean, those videos have stood for a very long time. The videos are called NIST Finally Admits Free Fall, where these findings are sort of documented. But as David will speak to in a little bit more detail, he spent time over the years kind of writing about this and thinking about it. But really in 2020, when 8 Truth was working on the request for correction, he really revisited it, and sort of collaborating with me, we were able to make some important discoveries about the fact that, as he's going to talk about more, by measuring the entire roof line, at least the north face roof line of the building, you could see that at all 3 points, it basically went into free fall at the same time. So he's going to talk about that in more detail. But anyway, this is a culmination of a process that began back in 2008. And then, as David's going to say a little bit more about, really, in the recent months, in the beginning of the first half of this year, we took it even a step further than where we left things off in 2020. So that's, in a nutshell, where this paper is going. And if there's one single takeaway that everyone needs to know, there's a handful that we want to focus on. But if there's one single takeaway that everybody needs to know, it's that we now know that across the entire measurable roof line of the building, both the north face and the west face, that the roof line, the transition to free fall was instantaneous and simultaneous across the entire roof line. And we didn't know that before. And that's very important because, I think David said in his video back in 2008, the fact that there's free fall alone is conclusive evidence of controlled demolition. But the fact that it's a sudden transition to free fall makes it even stronger. And that was the one thing that NIST hung their hat on, was this idea of saying, okay, there was free fall, fine, but there was this buildup to free fall before it which sort of makes it seem more like a natural progressive collapse. And so now we know, or at least what we put forward in this paper, is that no, there was no gradual transition to free fall. It was instantaneous. So with that, I guess I'll hand it off to David.
You need to unshare your screen.
Yeah.
There we go. So, okay, there we are. All right. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and show you a few things here. Okay. These got mixed up. Give me a second here. There. All right. Everybody see these little colored dots on the building? The dark blue one over here. Can you see my cursor, by the way? Is that visible?
David, right now we're only seeing like the thumbnails of all these videos. So.
Really? Okay. Well, then I have to do something different. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to share the screen instead of just the one thing. And now can you see a bunch of thumbnails there? And
yep.
All right. Now if I go to here, now can you see the building?
Yes. Okay.
So this is building 7. I want to point out, by the way, notice the building looks like it's tilted. And this is an interesting situation. This was a distant camera that I believe it was BBC, but I'm not sure. One of the news agencies had this camera set up and they had it focused and it was running, but nobody was manning it. It was just sitting there. And therefore, it's perfectly stable. All of the other video footage we have of this, there was somebody at the camera. And so if they did a little bit of, it might have been stationary for a while, but little bits of movement and so forth mess up the measurement. So this camera, even though it's tilted, it was perfectly stationary. In fact, what I did, see this building off here to the right a little bit? I actually tracked the corner of that building itself, and it didn't move more than about 4 inches. I mean, as far as what we're really talking about is how stable is the building is not moving, but I mean the measurement point was stable within about 4 inches. So that tells us these are really good measurements. So this is not the video I used way back at the beginning, but it somehow came to my attention that this would be a good one to use. This one is the one that NIST refers to as camera 2. So if you're reading through our paper, we refer to camera 2 and camera 3. This is camera 2 and so forth. see the dark blue dot right about in here. So there's a point right close to that. I'm not sure if it's that point, but it's very close to it, that NIST tracked. And the thing is, the middle of the building, there was some stuff going on before the whole thing let go and crashed down in free fall. I measured this red dot way over the right. That's the point I used. It was pretty obvious. Let's just track that point and see how that comes down. And that's the one. It just literally turned a corner from being fully supported to being zero support. Like from one frame to the next, it was just boom, you're in free fall. Another point to mention is this building is big. From side to side, it's 100 meters. So that's like the size of a football field overlapping into the end zones, okay? That's how big this is, and the width is comparable to a football field too. So if you can imagine a building occupying a football field, you have lots of columns here, and in order for this whole thing to come straight down, it has to, all of the columns had to let go simultaneously, okay? If one was just, hey, a half a second behind another, it was going to cause the building to tip, and it didn't tip. It came, the roof line stayed level all the way down. I'm moving my hands, but you can't see me. Sorry about that. Anyway, so ultimately, see the green one, this corner, and then the red one, this corner, and then 2 points on the face here. And I gotta, whoopsie, let's back out of this if I can. Don't tell me I have to stop sharing. Okay, let's go to this one. Are
you looking for the west face?
I'm looking for the west face one. Do you see that?
Right. Just to the right. Yeah, I didn't see it at first either.
Oh, I see. It's being hidden by all these pictures of people there. There we go. This one here. You see that? So I also use this camera. This is a handheld camera. And so it's much harder to figure out how to do decent measurements. But I measured these 3 points, the 2 corners and a point along the roof. What I did, I mean, the camera, even though it's pretty decent, it's not stable enough to give good solid measurements. So what I did was, I'm not showing it here, but I took a point on this foreground building. So that should be a stationary point. And so any movement of that point represents a movement of the camera. So I basically took the differences. I took these 3 points and a reference point, and then I just dumped the whole thing into a spreadsheet, did a computation, and so forth. So I was able to, the main thing I got out of these, I didn't really track them to get the acceleration or anything like that. I just wanted to see the time that they let go. And so I was able to confirm that these 3 points were simultaneous. The red one is the same as on this north face over here. And so that these other 2 additional points are actually letting go at the same time. This is interesting because one of NIST's claims was that all we're seeing is this north facade and everything else in the building had already collapsed away. And so they're basically trying to say, you're not seeing what you're really seeing. And what we're showing here is, well, we got 2 of the faces and we have 3 of the corners. It looks like we have pretty much the 3-dimensional extent of this building, and it all let go simultaneously. So that was the big deal on that. Let me do this. I wanted to show one other. This is an old video thing I did, but I was talking over with Ted and he thought it's still going to be relevant. So I'm going to show this little video clip. This is showing every time that little clock goes around once is a second. Let me start it again. Okay, so it's a 1 second circle, and so that's 5.4 seconds. This was the time that NIST claimed was how long it took the building to fall. Watch me run it backwards, in slow motion. So you tell me when a fair measurement would, here, let's do that. You tell me when a fair stopwatch should have marked the start of the fall of the building. And look at that clock. It's still going. That's when they started their clock. No wonder they get 5.4 seconds rather than the time for actual free fall. So NIST was lying right from the very get-go here. Okay, let me stop the sharing. Okay, NIST's initial claim was that the building came down 40% slower than free fall because they were using that phony baloney timing that they conjured up. And they really had to stretch to figure out how to make it come down slower than free fall, at least in their measurements. And the thing is that in order to do that, they put a formula in their report. And it's a simple little square root of something over something. I'd have to look at it again. That little formula does not apply to this kind of measurement. So they're literally using an erroneous formula. They're taking an erroneous timing, and this was their original thing in their draft report. And so that's what I responded to when I had an opportunity. One of the advantages of working with a group, like I was working with AE, and somebody in AE passed around on the mailing list that, hey, NIST is going to have this opportunity to ask questions at a technical briefing conference. We need to get some of our guys in there asking questions. So I thought, well, I'll jump into it. But then I realized to fill out the little application, you have to tell what institution you're affiliated with and stuff. And I said, whoa, I'm not a professor at a university. I'm not in a high-tech company or anything like that. I was teaching at a charter school, a K-12 charter school at the time. So I thought, this doesn't look like I'm a serious questioner here. But then I set it aside, but at the very last minute, on the last day to submit that, I just thought, well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. I got to do it one way or another. So I basically used the fact that I'm a member of the American Association of Physics Teachers, and I put that down as my institutional affiliation and sent it in. And I didn't know that I was accepted to ask a question until literally 5 minutes before the conference started. And I got an email with a link. And it was literally, I had my books in my hand. I was getting ready to walk out the door and go to school. And I saw that on my email. So I put my books down, typed out a question, hit enter, and went to school. I didn't know for a couple of weeks if it had even been asked. But that was, you got to watch that. So that's on my website. My website is 911speakout.org. But I have that little incident there. And the way Sham Sunder, who was the head of this thing, the way he responded, I mean, hey, he was the star of the show. So that was really entertaining to watch him respond to the simplest possible question you could. I mean, by the way, when you're questioning somebody, make it a simple, single, to the point question where they can't wander around it. And that's the best way, I think, to force them to reveal the issues, So anyway, that was a high point. But then I started looking at the implications of all of these answers. When they did their final report, it was, they did a reanalysis, which admitted free fall right in the graph, but they continued to maintain support for their original. So they have two theories for how this is. It's not at free fall, it's coming 40% slower than free fall. And oh yeah, we have this other 3-stage thing. They tried to put them both together in their final report. So anyway, this whole thing was a big mess. NIST does not have a coherent explanation for how this building, even describing how this building came down. So that's sort of painting that whole picture. In my mind, that was the goal of this paper, is to see what we did and what NIST, what NIST was trying to do, and just underlining how fraudulent it really was. It wasn't a slip up. It wasn't just like, oh, change this. No, it was they just completely screwed up there. So anyway, that's my. Are there things that maybe Ted, I maybe need to? Somebody needs to put both of us on the screen there, maybe.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thanks, David. Yeah, to drive home one point that David made earlier on is the fact that NIST measured that 1 point, right? So there's 1 point that's sort of near the middle, and based on that 1 point, so this was one of the main discoveries in 2020, working together on the request for correction, was David finally like zoomed in on that point and measured that point along with the corner that he had been measuring, and he measured the other corner. And he said, whoa, you know what? When you actually use this video footage, which is the best video footage to use, he actually was able to see a little bit of like a tiny bit of downward motion at that point. And it was like, it wasn't like a smooth motion either. It was like a downward drop. And then like
drops about a meter, then it stopped, and then it let go.
And then it let go. So NIST basically used the tiny bit of movement at that point to say, that's when global collapse initiation occurred, right? Which is 7 seconds after, 6.9 seconds, but basically 7 seconds after the beginning of the east penthouse collapse on the east side of the building, right? So in my mind, for the past like many years, I was like, yeah, the building collapsed. The building started to go down 7 seconds after the east penthouse started to go down. But there was like, I remember running through the situations where like, wait, I don't see any movement there. It feels like it's not quite 7 seconds. And the reality is that it's actually 8 seconds.
8.1, 8.2, something like that.
So it's actually more than a whole second later. And so based on this tiny little bit of movement at that 1 point in the roof line, they say global collapse initiated. They say that there was downward motion of a certain, 1.5 or 2 meters or whatever. And it's an entire stage of the collapse, when in reality, that point did move a little bit, but then that point also went into free fall at the same time as the other points along the roof line that David eventually measured. So they zoomed in on this 1 point and created this fabricated first stage. Initially, I guess that was done to claim that the collapse time was 40% slower than free fall. And then the real value of that little bit of movement and starting it early was once they admitted that free fall took place, they still had this early stage where the collapse was building up, where there was, and so the idea here is, and NIST knows this, is that you're not going to have a natural building collapse suddenly just, start and the whole building goes into free fall. Chaim Sunder even said it, in a roundabout way back in 2008, that you have to have a series of structural failures where everything is not instantaneous. So with this fabricated stage one, NIST painted this picture that there was these sequence of structural failures taking place that were leading to the total collapse, that were leading to the free fall. And in fact, there wasn't. There was something going on there, possibly related to some of the core columns near that exterior part of the exterior starting to fail, possibly due to the columns below the east penthouse, which had been taken out 7 seconds earlier. But there was no motion of the building. David?
I want to share my screen and show something here. Okay. This is camera 3. Oh, here we are. Notice the V shape that's going to develop in here. Look at that. See that V shape in there? And for a long time, we interpreted that as a kink in the building, that's sort of like that came down and it's like a vertical kink. Well, Jeremy Hammond pointed out to me before, he tried to publish a paper, but the paper didn't get published, but I was reviewing it and I said, aha. He pointed out that this kink is not where it's coming down. It's moving sideways. It's a lateral fold. It's like the north fold. It's like the north wall of that building has a vertical crease in it. And notice the camera is looking up at that roof line. Okay. From that angle, the roof looks like it has a big bend in it. But you noticed a few minutes ago, I showed you camera 2, which was from a horizontal perspective. It looked perfectly flat. So how come this can look perfectly flat from one angle, and it looks like it has this kink in it from this other angle? So NIST in the document claims they used camera 3, that's this camera, as the basis of their measurements. I mean, they say right out that they used camera 3. I mean, it's up closer and whatever, but it has this fact that because it's looking at an angle, you have this little parallax effect, and you can't tell if that's vertical or horizontal there just by looking at it. And so they're taking that lateral motion, and then if you look at this horizontally, like from that more distant camera, camera 2, there's a, if this thing is here, let me just, you need to see my hands here. If this thing is folding and you're looking up at it and you're seeing what looks like this kink, and horizontally, this lateral motion has a tiny vertical component. So that vertical motion that we're actually seeing from camera 2, it's under magnification that you can see it. And it's like, if I take this and rotate it, it's mostly going sideways, but it's a little bit down, isn't it? So if you have the little bit of rotation of that wall, we're seeing a bit of real downward motion, but that's just the component of this fold that we're looking at. In other words, it's all messed up. And so they're claiming that's when the fall started, and it's absolutely not. Anyway, but the point is, even with that as this little precursor motion, if you want to think of it that way, when it actually went into free fall, it was simultaneous with when the corners of the building went into free fall. So anyway, there you go.
Yeah. So the latter part of the paper, and this is where we'll focus on just a couple more takeaways. The latter part of the paper then looks at, NIST, the NIST investigation basically revolved around trying to create a computer model that could replicate the behavior that was observed on 9/11 in the collapse of this building. And so these are very important claims that NIST makes in their report, saying that our computer model matched the observed behavior reasonably well. And so we took we wanted to then, now that we actually have properly characterized the behavior, let's ask the question, does their model actually replicate the collapse? And is their story consistent with it? Now, in the last 10 years, let's say, what's gotten a lot of focus as far as Building 7 is concerned is the initiation of the supposed collapse sequence of the building, the NIST scenario of the collapse of the building, the initiating event. So people have heard about column 79, floor 13, girder A2001, et cetera, et cetera. This happened, that happened, and it led to this column buckling. And this was the chain reaction that started with that series of alleged events. The latter part of the collapse, besides the kind of work that David's been doing, looking at the downward motion, but the latter part of NIST's story about how the building collapsed hasn't gotten as much attention. So what a lot of people, and maybe some of you don't totally know, is that, what NIST says happened is that once that column 79 failed, you then had this sequence of core column failures going from the east to the west, and sort of overlapping with that, then you get exterior column failures starting to happen on the outside of the building, and that starts at the southwest corner, right? And that's pretty important. NIST says that where the exterior column started to buckle was in the southwest corner of the building, okay? And that once that started to happen, you had this spread of column buckling, column failures occurring along the outside of the building, spreading in both directions, okay? Now that we know that the building actually goes into free fall simultaneously across the entire width, both the north face and the west face, that's where the west face is where NIST says that the exterior buckling began. But if the columns in the southwest corner had started to buckle first, and then that had spread around, you would have shortened it. That would have shortened those columns on the southwest corner on the west face, and you would start to see that downward movement over on the west face before you would start to see it on the north face. So if you and it's hard to like dig to piece together what NIST's story actually is. There's a lot of confusing and slightly conflicting information even within their story. And so one of the things that we do in this paper is really carefully piece together what their story is and actually like show and diagram when all the column failures occurred according to NIST, right? And we show, wait, this sequence doesn't match what we now have in terms of the observed behavior, right? So they say it started on the southwest corner. That's not what you see in the video. The other aspect of how their model does not replicate the observed behavior, does not match the observed behavior, is in the way that it actually looks. And we've all seen some of those images of the NIST model, the way that there's huge amount of.
I'm going to share this as you speak because I have that. Go ahead.
Sure.
No, keep going.
Yeah. So you share that, and you've got the deformation. And so this was work that I really started doing methodically when I was working on the request for correction 3 years ago, was really demonstrating 3 ways in which NIST's model did not match the observed behavior. The first one is in the deformation. And so that's because basically, if you see here on the picture on the right, down there on the bottom is where the column 79 allegedly buckled and then caused this sort of cascade of failures above it all the way up to the roof line, and the penthouse drops in.
This is their model.
This is their model. So if that actually happened with buckling low down in the building and all these columns are failing on the east side of the building, you're going to get the east part of the building actually deflecting inwards. What you're seeing there, because that's looking at the building from the south, you're looking at the east face of the building deflecting inwards because all these floor failures and column failures are happening on the east side of the building. Of course, as we know in the video, the building was completely motionless. None of the faces of the building, at least what we can see on the north face, were deforming. And here in this picture, although it's kind of hard to tell, the northeast corner has completely folded away from the rest of the north face. So there's that. There's also the fact that in this model, the building actually starts to tip to the south. And if you can see it a little bit in that picture on the left there with the view from the west, you can see that sort of southward tipping. And, I would wager that if the model had continued, the building would have continued to tip southwards. And that's one of the reasons why they terminated the model when they did.
Yeah, they terminated just a few seconds after it started to come down. They just cut off their animation.
Yep. And then the last thing, which is something that we did that's brand new, was actually look at the downward motion in the model and measure that. So we took the same kind of technique that we used for the actual video, for the real data. We took that and we applied that to NIST's model. And we found that there was actually movement well before the supposed collapse initiation time, the global collapse initiation. And we found, I think, significantly that that it never quite reached free fall. It got pretty close to free fall at the end, but it never quite reached it. And that to get to that, even that somewhat approximating free fall, there was still a gradual transition. And that's the key. Even NIST's model, which was maybe very sophisticated in the calculations that it was doing, said, if you're going to get this building to come down, the transition to free fall or near free fall is not going to be instantaneous. There's going to be a gradual transition. So that was one part of the paper. So bottom line is, we now know that NIST model, better than we ever knew before, that NIST model does not match the observed behavior. We then laid out what a sequence of column failures, which is basically a demolition sequence, a demolition scenario that obviously matches the observed behavior perfectly, and we all know this, of course. But we also tied to that, because one thing that we wanted to look at, which was the east penthouse, the fact that falls first and that starts to come down 8 seconds before the rest of the building. Why is that? And why is that able to happen without any deformation occurring on the building? In this model, when the east penthouse starts to come down, the whole building has actually already begun to deform and deforms much more. Why is there no deformation in the building when the east penthouse comes down? The simple answer to that is that whoever took this building down cut the columns below the east penthouse, columns 79 and 80, very high up in the building. And so by cutting them high up in the building, they brought the penthouse down, but the penthouse then fell into the building and basically stopped there. And there was no more structural, instability or structural failures or, cutting of columns happening lower in the building that would have caused much more deformation.
Yeah, when that east penthouse came in, only a few windows broke. I mean, there was a chain of window breakage, but it's just very limited. And there's no more window breakage anywhere until the whole thing came down, which shows it was not a gradual process going on. If that penthouse coming in would cause this cascade of window breakage, just imagine, like NIST is claiming the entire interior had collapsed ahead of, all we're seeing is this outer shell. Well, by the way, an answer to that is if all this interior stuff had collapsed already and we're just looking at the remaining shell, all of that humongous cloud of dust that went rolling down the streets, that would have already been rolling down the streets while we're still watching the building come down. And that's not what happened. The dust that came out was simultaneous with the visible collapse of the building. So yeah, the interior and the exterior fell at the same time. So what we're really seeing is what was really going on.
Absolutely. And so really the start of the demolition sequence, of course, there were explosions going off earlier in the day and probably in the several minutes and even hours leading up to the collapse. But the final demolition sequence basically started with those columns below the penthouse being taken out first, and then the rest of the columns in the building. And we actually have both eyewitness and seismic evidence that is consistent with and supports the fact that there were explosions that started happening when that east penthouse started to come down, just a split second before it, and that basically then continued and culminated with when the building came down. The seismic signals that are documented by NIST in Appendix B of their NC Star 1-9 report, their longer report on Building 7, began 8 to 10 seconds before the whole building started to come down. And they tried to say that those seismic signals were created by this handful of floors in the northeast corner of the building sort of collapsing down on each other, which is just totally, in my view, totally ludicrous. And then you've got a big seismic signal that occurs not like once the building starts coming down, but actually like 1 or 2 seconds apparently before it starts to come down. You've got the second seismic signal. So you've got that, and then you've got this eyewitness evidence and audio evidence actually as well in the videos, which is also some analysis that David did back in 2010, looking at this video of Ashley Banfield. The explosions that Ashley Banfield heard that caused her to look and turn towards Building 7. Ashley Banfield was a reporter for MSNBC. She heard a very loud sound from, 700 meters away that caused her to look towards the building. That sound was actually the explosions that were started that took down the east penthouse. And then once she's already looking at the building for about 5 seconds, that's when the rest of the whole building starts to go down.
Watch when she turns her head. And when she turns her head, the building hasn't started coming down. It's the explosions she's hearing.
Put your sound on, David.
Oh, I see. I don't have my sound on. All right, let's stop sharing. I'm going to share again and click the little box like I've been telling everybody they need to do. And I need to do it.
Starting to see people moving north. In fact, you were just told by police that you should move out of your apartment, Fabiana. Yes. You've got Carolina here?
Yes. They advised us to leave because we have...
Oh, my God. Look behind us. Please pan in this way.
So when she turns and she says, oh, my God, and all that stuff, she's hearing stuff. In fact, there's a bang, 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 bang. There's 7 hits in a very rapid sequence there. There's 2 more that were prior to that. So boom, and then 7 hits in a row. And then you hear the roar of the crowd indicating that the building is starting to come down. Watch that.
Please be careful of your baby. This is it. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. Oh.
So when that crowd roar rises, that's when they start to see the building coming down. In fact, we could calibrate that because there's another video from the same intersection here that's looking at the building, and you can see when the roar of the crowd rises compared to when the building actually comes down. And so it's not when she turns her head and looks, it's when the crowd roars that you actually have visible movement of the building. She's hearing explosions going off prior to that. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that was so with that, we were able actually to like correlate everything that's going on in the Ashley Banfield video with the time frame that we had from the other videos of all these events happening in the building, the fall of the East Penthouse, the fall of the overall structure, and so on. And so the eyewitness evidence, the audio evidence, the seismic evidence all match up pretty much perfectly with this series of explosions going off over this 8 to 10 second period. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Let me just bring up this slide here. I'll share my screen just to summarize what we just covered. Okay. Oh, no, next one. All right. So for me, my Zoom thing is covering up this slide. So I'm not sure that I'll be able to read it all. Oh, I can move it around. There we go.
You can move that row of pictures. Just grab the top of them and move them around.
Got it. So basically, I'm just going to read it. The takeaways here. One, the entire measurable roof line of WTC7, meaning the north and west faces, went into free fall instantaneously and simultaneously. Two, NIST global collapse initiation is 1.4 seconds before the downward motion of the roof line. And NIST stage 1 is fabricated, falsely giving the impression of a gradual buildup to free fall. 3, NIST global collapse analysis is not consistent with the observed behavior. Yeah, we knew that. But looking a little closer at it, NIST scenario says that the exterior column buckling started at the southwest corner, which is incompatible with the video evidence. And NIST animation looks nothing like the actual collapse in several important respects. Lastly, and my Zoom is covering this up. Here we go. Number 4.
You want me to read it? I can read it on mine.
Go for it, David.
Yeah, it says seismic and eyewitness evidence of explosions over a period of 10 seconds supports the demolition scenario. So, yeah,
and I should have said audio as well because we have the audio evidence from the Ashley Banfield clip, as well as the NIST's camera 3 taken from
another
west.
Boom.
There's a boom in that one as well. So, yeah, that's it. And
I think we're ready for Q&A, actually.
Yep.
Yes, our first question will be from David Schlesinger. Go ahead and unmute yourself, David.
Let me just make a comment here first, if you don't mind, Gene.
Yeah.
And then we'll get to Dave. I'd like to kick it off with my question, actually, which is, first of all, again, I am so impressed with the research and the clarity of the writing. I could follow it. I don't have a scientific background like these guys. So let me just add a comment at how I understand this, and then I'll ask my question. And then from then on, everyone can ask their questions. So my comment is, as I understand it, Ted and David, your research, by being able to measure points on both the north face and now the west face, you have basically put a nail in the coffin of NIST assertion that this was a gradual transition to free fall.
Yep.
And by measuring all those points, you have put a nail in that coffin.
With my hammer.
Yes, with your hammer. The question I have is it not possible for there to be controlled demolition, even with a gradual transition into free fall? Does that preclude a free fall? Does that preclude controlled demolition, even if there is a gradual transition into free fall? That's my question.
I'll answer it, Ted.
You go for it, David.
Okay. If there is a period of free fall, which even NIST's graph shows there was assuming, just take everything NIST did for granted. They have a graph with 2¼ seconds of absolute free fall. During that period of absolute free fall, it means there is zero resistance across the entire width of the building.
Mhm.
And that's equivalent to 8 floors of falling. So it's like removing the columns over a range of 8 floors, okay? So even just going from that and not doing any other measurements, even that is not consistent from this point of view. It would still point to a demolition. So that's my contention. But what we've done is we've basically shown that they have been faking it at every turn. So that's really, there we go.
I see. Okay. All right. Anything to add, Ted?
I think David nailed it. But I would just say that, yes, the conclusion that it was controlled demolition is not dependent on the fact that it was instantaneous. Conceivably, there could be a controlled demolition where there was a gradual buildup to free fall of some portion of the building. But so the fact that it's instantaneous, just, it puts the nail in the coffin and shows that it's completely inconceivable that it would be a natural collapse.
Great. Okay. We're opening it up to questions now. And Gene, who's the first person?
It's Dave Schlesinger.
Dave Schlesinger. That's right. Okay, Dave.
Finding the mute button.
Second.
You're now spotlighted, Dave.
No, he's not. I can hear him.
And you can't hear you, brother.
Let me just see. Dave
You have to
Schlesinger.
remove. I'm removing.
Yes.
Oh, no, I blew it.
I think
trying to help.
I think he can
Dave
ask. We're
Schlesinger.
all spotlighted, but I think he can ask his question anyway.
Okay, go ahead.
Is he unmuted though?
No, he's muted.
Oh,
You're muted,
unmute
Dave.
David. Dave, unmute.
Okay,
There you
very
go.
good. Very good. Ted, do you agree an early mention in podcast guest appearances should include the fact that no plane hit the World Trade Center 7?
Yeah, that sounds reasonable.
Okay. Because I didn't hear it on Clayton.
Okay, I think I did, but if I didn't, I'll keep that in mind. So
Right. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you. The
Thanks,
next
Dave.
question was Richard, and then we'll go to you, Michael. Go ahead, Richard.
All right, just a second. Unmute, Richard.
There we go. You got to unmute. There we go.
That's kind of tedious process for Zoom, but I understand the necessity. 2 questions. Well, first of all, a comment. The fact that we don't see any light through the windows at any of the upper levels after NIST claims that there was an internal collapse, including the roof, would be obvious, right? I mean, we would see through the windows daylight, even the intact windows, most of them were intact. Just your comment on that, and then I'll ask my 2 questions.
After the east penthouse fell, you can see light through the, at least the top floor, maybe the second floor. And it's only in the area underneath. Well, that's not a good one to show it, but okay, even right there, you can see a little bit of light in there.
Yeah, you
But
can.
That's the only place where you can see the light. But then as the rest of the building falls, you don't see an additional. So that's correct.
Well,
You're right.
I mean, they claim the inside of the building was gutted.
I know. So that
But
can't be. Well,
yeah,
there's a dozen different ways that can't be, including what you just said.
And the penthouses, structures, and screen wall, the west penthouse and screen wall up there.
Can I share, Richard? I think it's a really good question. I want to share one graphic that is in this paper that just to shed light on this question of yours. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. All right. So what I did here was go through and sort of very carefully, from reading all parts of the NIST report, sort of show where NIST basically claims each column failed timing. Okay. Yeah. And so zero in the zero, all these numbers are in relation to the time 0, which is the time that the east penthouse began to visibly collapse. So the column below the east penthouse, according to NIST, started to buckle 1.3 seconds before the east penthouse started to go down. And then it kind of continued this way and continued this way. Now, what I was surprised to find when I really started going very carefully through their story is that some of these columns they say failed in their collapse sequence much later than we would have anticipated, based on the idea of this clean story of the core columns sort of failing first in an east to west progression, and then the exterior columns failing. In fact, what you see here is some of these columns actually failing a split second, it's 0.2 of a second before. What they say is like when the collapse basically culminated with these exterior columns up here in the Northeast. Some of these columns, according to NIST, hung around for a while. You actually, and this is important, they don't even get their east to west progression to happen if they don't independently have a column right here, column 66, fail because of alleged fire damage and then alleged damage from the exterior, and then vibrations in the building caused by these columns starting to fail. There was a column that independently failed long before the columns in between it and the eastern columns failed. Again, this is according to NIST's, fairy tale story. So
that's that negative number in there, right?
That's that negative number in there. This happened. They're saying this column 66 failed half a second before the east penthouse started to fall. And that probably a lot of, and what is really implied here is that a lot of this column failure that happened in this area of the building wouldn't have even happened if this one didn't fail. And these columns failing, again, the southwest corner here occurs before, according to NIST, these core columns started failing. And somehow in less than a second, basically, you have column failure spread from the southwest corner all the way to the northeast corner. All of this is totally, in my mind, totally absurd. But my point is that this idea that the building had completely hollowed out is somewhat, I think, somewhat based on like NIST's very simplistic description of their collapse scenario in NC Star 1A, the main summary report on Building 7. And if you actually dig into the details, it's a complicated, convoluted scenario that's not clean at all.
It's not even self-consistent.
It's not self-consistent, but it also doesn't really support the idea that the building had completely hollowed out. The building, you had this set of failures allegedly happen here, and then this a couple 2-3 seconds later here, and then everything starts to go here. Not that far from when we see the penthouse, the other stuff on the roof start to go in. So this idea that it was just a hollow shell for some period of time, a second or two or a few seconds, is not exactly what NIST's story is. And that's one of the things that I learned digging in more deeply into their report, working on this paper.
Oh.
Okay.
Next, NIST picked a point in time 1.4 seconds before the actual downward movement. What did they base that on? I thought I heard Sham say that there was John Gross, a single pixel changed. Is that really all that was, or were they seeing some movement that you've seen also, Dave?
Can I answer? Remember when I said that this kind of a fold is going on? And then from horizontally, you can see just a little component of that is a slight reduction here. They're taking the camera 3 thing. As soon as that fold starts, you have what was once wall is now sky. And that's what John Gross was talking about. So it's an invalid marker for the start of downward motion. So he's fudging their period of downward motion by taking this little indicator that doesn't really say it.
If the whole building was beginning to fold.
No, that wall, there was internal structural things going on.
The screen wall. I mean, the
north face of the building, it folded like this.
How tall of a fold was that?
Well, I mean, it's like draw a line down the north face of the building, crease it there, and fold it along that line.
So
that up here, looking up at the building, it looks like it's a V-shaped notch, like it looks like it's coming down, but it's actually going sideways.
So you're saying the building, whole half of, or maybe all, or the upper half of the building is actually folding before it comes down. I think that's a speculation.
So you see this line here across the top, it looks straight, right? But if you view it from here, it looks like it's.
No, I understand that.
So that's the deal there. They're using an invalid observational technique to tell.
I understand that, but you're not quite hearing the nuance of my question. That is, if in fact the whole building or the upper half of it is folding some degree against itself, then that's a huge structural problem for the building. And so whether or not it's coming down, it may need to be accounted for in the collapse of this building. I'm thinking rather that it's just the parapet wall that's folding or falling or bending backward away from us.
Yeah. Well, what I would say here is that the truly visible fold doesn't really become apparent until about 1 to 2 seconds into the downward motion of the building. But as David is suggesting, there was probably something that was starting to happen there prior to the downward motion of the roof line. All right. And sorry, I'm getting a little distracted by the video coming up.
Sorry.
So it's okay. No worries. So basically, and as David spoke to, I think that, he suspects, I think we all suspect that, and Tony agrees with this, that there obviously something happened in the building around that time because the penthouse came down, and so there's probably some column severing or, failures that are starting to happen in that area of the building, which is pretty close to where the East Penthouse went down. But that movement, right, especially at that early stage, because the fold hasn't completely, developed yet, that it has nothing to do with, well, obviously it's all related. It's part of the demolition scenario, but nothing intrinsic to do with the downward.
Cause the demolition. It didn't
cause the overall downward motion. So what we can, if something happened there, sure, that had something to do with the overall destruction of this building. The point is that calling that global collapse initiation is misleading. To say that that's when the global collapse initiated, or to say that's when downward motion began, which is, if you read in this report, that's what they say. They paint that little bit of movement, whatever was going on there, as the beginning of the downward motion of the building, when in fact the building is stationary for another almost second and a half.
And after a couple of seconds into the downward motion of the building, you can literally see that crease all the way down. So it's not just the parapet wall.
Okay.
It really is there. In fact, interestingly enough, NIST actually has in their document that thing that the east side of the building moved to the north is the way that they described it. So in other words, they're actually, the thing is, this big, huge document, I don't think the people in NIST read the whole thing because there are contradictory elements all over the place. One of them is that in one place, they describe that vertical crease and the fold, and in another place, it's like they ignore it entirely. So anyway, there we go.
Finally, if there's another 1.4 seconds of free fall, we would add that to the first 2.5 seconds that you measured previously.
No, that's not happening.
No,
nothing's moving at the beginning. They're just fabricating all that early stuff.
Yeah,
it's
I got
just
that backwards.
Yeah.
So we still only have your measurement of 2.5 seconds of free fall.
Whatever. Yeah, that free fall part, that's when the actual downward motion started. And you can track it on all these points that boom, everything starts and it moves down.
Got it. Thanks.
Okay.
All right. I want to just, before our next questioner and Jean, I want to just be sure I understand this. The NIST is saying that those column 79 severed low down, but you're saying no, it had to sever high up because we don't see the daylight through the windows except high up. Is that correctly understood?
Yeah, the not only the daylight, there's a couple important other observational pieces of evidence besides the daylight, and that's towards the very end of the paper. But I will use NIST's own model as evidence. NIST's model predicts a huge amount of deformation when column 79 fails low down in the building. And that's because you have the column fail and all these floors then collapse, right? And all this stuff happens in the entire eastern side of the building from top to bottom.
All these girders are attaching into the column, and you pull the build, it's like pulling down the tent pole.
Yeah, so if you pull the column down and all these girders, all these floors are connected to it, you're going to get all this deformation, all this pulling and all this deformation happening on the outside. That's what NIST's model actually predicts. That's the valid information that the NIST model gives us. But in reality, none of that happened. When you cut it high in the building, most of column 79 is still there. It's only the very top. The penthouse falls in, and that entire local process there had very little impact on the rest of the structure.
When we were writing this paper, we had to consciously decouple our mind from focusing on column 79. Column 79 is part of NIST's fantasy. And so if you see what really happens, it's not all about column 79. It's about a demolition. And so literally we had to sort of, hey, we're still tying things to when this happened. Well, it didn't happen like that. Anyway, is that correct? I mean, we talked about that, right?
That's correct. Yeah, that is correct. But we did have to also say they had to do something to column 79 to get the penthouse.
Up high, yeah.
So we didn't, you stop talking about the failure of column 79. And when you're dealing with what's going on there, you say, the collapse of the East penthouse. What caused the collapse of the East penthouse? Certainly don't presume that it had to do with any column 79 failing low in the building. Maybe it actually failed really high in the building. And this is also covered in Leroy Halsey's report as well. This issue.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Gene. Be aware that Michael Hoy has his hand raised, and Michael, be sure you put your question in the chat to Gene Laratonda. But just okay. And so, Gene, who's the next person?
That is Michael, and I'm not sure what his question is, but
okay, just a second. Let me spotlight Michael. And Michael, be sure to unmute yourself.
And put your hand down.
There's Michael Hoy. He's part of Colorado 9/11 Truth.
Good morning. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. I thought I'd add a little bit before I asked my question to the discussion you were just having, since I couldn't chime in because I can't unmute. The way I see what you're presenting is that the penthouse started to come down, which meant there was some structural failure probably caused by the demolition. And there's very likely some heavy equipment up in those penthouses. I don't know how it was built. I haven't seen drawing, but unlikely there's a chiller up there, but there could be. There could certainly be some heavy pumps. And they might have wanted, if their intent is to implode the building, have things come to the center, they might want that heavy equipment moving downward in the middle, basically pulling on girders. And that could be one of the reasons you see that kink it's not necessarily a fold in the building, it's a kink in the one wall of the building. We don't know what's going on the opposite south side of the building.
Right.
But that could be one of the things that they intentionally did from a demolition standpoint to make sure things stayed within the footprint, is to start bringing some heavy stuff, getting it moving down through the building. So that leads to my question, which is whether it's really NIST faking this thing and whether it's important whether they faked it or whether they just did a report that wasn't good enough and wasn't detailed enough to withstand external analysis and criticism. They took some measurements, they built a model, and they came up with their results, but they didn't really cross-check and do the kind of detailed analysis necessary to make sure that their model was actually correct. So that's my question. In other words, how important is it they faked it versus they just did a poor job?
Yeah, my sense is that they knew that free fall was incompatible with a natural progressive collapse, and they wanted to avoid free fall, avoid acknowledging it. They tried, and were stopped by David and Stephen Jones. And so they were forced to acknowledge it. And the only way that they could at all even come close to reconciling free fall with their natural progressive collapse scenario was to stick to this concept that they had sort of started by the collapse beginning earlier than it actually did, and therefore claim that there was a stage prior to when free fall began. And so I think, I think they didn't want to do a more careful measurement. They might have done it on their own, but they didn't want to publish a more careful measurement that showed that the entire roof line went into free fall at the same time, because instantaneously, because it would be so obviously incompatible with their story and incompatible with the idea of a natural progressive collapse. So my sense is that it was intentional, because that free fall in a way was maybe with a couple of other things as well, like the melting of the steel, the sulfidation, et cetera, was highly damning to their story. So my sense is it was intentional. And I think it is important to sort of get all of this out, iron it all out and understand exactly how they sort of tiptoed around this issue. That's my sense. David, what do you think?
They were lying from day one. I mean, I don't give them any grace on this stuff. They were lying every turn. I mean, I kept on running into all of these assertions that just aren't true. And they keep asserting things in order to pave the way for their story. And they're denying. They had to get to the end of the Bush administration, and then they published their final report during the lame duck period. So I think then they went and they walked away from it. They're not answering our request for correction. They refuse to acknowledge it. So they are just staying away from this because they don't have a case. If you actually look at what happened, it does not support their scenario. So that's my take on it.
Dean, who's next?
That is all the questions we had.
Whoa.
Oh, good. It looks like Richard has a question. I saw his hand raised. Is that true, Richard?
Yeah, I see his hand. Go ahead and put Richard on
I'm
there.
sorry. Real quick to help everybody, this is a photo of the top of 7.
Ah, yes.
You can see the...
Oh, good.
That's the east. This is from the south.
Yes.
So that's the east penthouse. Then
Screen
that is the machinery that's behind what's called a screen wall. So you can see there's a screen wall on both sides. And then there's the west penthouse over there. Okay. Got it? I think you were asking me about this before the presentation.
Yeah, just for clarification, yes. And then column 79.
That's a good picture to let people know what we're talking about. So
forgive me if I say this wrong. Column 79 is in this location?
No.
Sorry.
Over there, yeah. That's right.
Thank you.
So it's underneath the east penthouse there. 79 and 80 are both underneath there.
That's where the heavy stuff is.
Which,
David, we had an interview for our new film series, 9/11 Crime Scene to Courtroom. Do you remember if in that interview many, many months ago, you actually incorporated these multiple points of sudden instantaneous free fall? Or do I have to interview you again? Because I still have time.
I don't know. I can't remember. I've done a number of interviews and I just keep throwing stuff out there. I do a lot of these. Well, every once in a while I give a talk that's very well orchestrated. Like Fran and Marty pin me down and make me do an outline before I give my talk. But a lot of the time it's sort of seat of the pants. It's just, I just bring everything in. So
all right,
I don't remember what I said there.
And we'll take care of it.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'd be glad to do another interview if you want.
Okay.
What's up?
All right, Gene, is that it? Do we have any more questions?
That is all we have.
Maybe we can pack up and go to dinner.
All right. You know, I think this has been, I don't know if I've been to a presentation, a discussion where we've had such excellent questions. So I want to thank everybody for the really substantial questions. I think we're ready to close up. And Ted, I want to hand it over to you to give your announcements and tell people about ic911.org.
Right. Yeah. Well, the big announcement I was supposed to make is that you can, we will be posting this video, and we'll be sending it out, both to Colorado 9/11 Truth as well as International Center for 9/11 Justice. We'll be sending it to our email lists. And if you found that this presentation was illuminating, feel free to share it with folks. Maybe people would prefer to watch this than to read the entire paper. Keep an eye out for that video. I just want to thank everybody for coming this evening. Thank you for participating in our work, and thank you for the response that we've received so far to the launch of the International Center for 9/11 Justice has been tremendously positive and supportive. And so we're very happy to know that people feel that this organization can help further the cause. And so I'm just grateful for everybody's support and for all of you who are here tonight. And if you haven't been to our website yet, you can find it. It's 5 characters, ic911.org, ic911.org. And all of the work that the Journal of 9/11 Studies has published, all of the Toronto hearings, presentations, and report, and all of the work of the 9/11 consensus panel, you can find there. The 51 points of the 9/11 consensus panel, we still have to finish formatting those, but those will be published in the coming weeks. And I want to really emphasize that the Journal of 9/11 Studies is totally open for business. So people that have been doing research recently or last many years, and they've been publishing on their own website or who knows where, please feel free to send your work to the Journal of 9/11 Studies. And, I think in time, we hope that there will be thousands of people visiting our website on a daily basis and reading the work of the journal. So I hope that you'll see the journal as a venue for your work to be published, or for your friends, colleagues, what have you. And the same goes for the Debated Topics Forum. The Debated Topics Forum is the other main publication that we have on the site, and that is to discuss topics that have been much more controversial in the movement, that are not necessarily shedding brand new light on a topic, but something that's been contentious. The whole point of that is to make it easy for folks to publish and for folks to respond to each other, and so that we can get a real proper, genuine, respectful, scientific dialogue going on some of those issues that have been more contentious. So, please feel free to submit your work, or encourage your friends who have strong opinions on different topics, or who are doing important new research in areas that haven't been researched as well. Encourage them to submit to either of these publications.
Just to announce that if anybody's looking to get this paper, if you come down on the page, you will see Journal of 9/11 Studies, and it is the first paper listed there on recommended articles. And please take a look at it.
Yeah, and you can read it, whether you want to read it on a web page or as a PDF, whatever's easier for you. The entire article is now available. All the articles that we publish in the Journal of 9/11 Studies and in the Debated Topics Forum will be available either as a web page article or as a PDF.
If you don't mind, I did have one question. I asked it at the beginning. I think it might benefit others. That this seems substantial, and it seems like there is some new information that might help architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth with the request for correction lawsuit. I don't know if anybody could speak on that.
Well, my understanding is, the only way that Mick Harrison is still working on behalf of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, litigating their attempt to get the request for correction properly answered by NIST, and that for this paper to be relevant in any way as evidence or something that's worth submitting to the court, I think Mick would have to feel that the paper goes further in showing that NIST's response to their request for correction is inadequate or irrational, and so on. So it may do that. I myself haven't given that question much thought, but so Gene, if you want to share with him, or I can certainly share it with Mick, and he can, explore that question if it would help make the case that NIST's response to the request for correction was inadequate.
Thank you very much.
All right. Are we ready to call it quits?
I think we're
Also,
done.
Ted, go ahead. Sorry.
we learned from Mick that they have
Oh,
scheduled
Richard?
oral arguments in that case. The judge has. That was just last week. So, or earlier this week. You didn't hear that yet, Ted?
I did actually hear that. I can't remember where from. Maybe it was from Gene last week or something. But yeah, and Mick mentioned it at the memorial for Graham McQueen last week.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a big step. That means, I think that means Mick gets to talk, or somebody gets to talk about the technical aspects. I don't know that. That would be great, though.
Absolutely.
Probably Roland, I'm guessing.
Well,
All right. I love all you guys. It's been a wonderful presentation. We'll see you next time.